Welcome to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Hey folks, come on in. We're going to get started in a second. And wow, we can have a great conversation this afternoon. Hey folks, we're going to get started. I want to first welcome you and wish you a happy afternoon. I'm Larry Jacobs. I am Director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance, University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Before we get going, I want to first encourage you to participate. We are eager to get your questions and we'll get to as many as possible. You can see at the bottom of the screen that Q&A button. That's your entry into the conversation this afternoon. And to the right, you'll see there's a live transcript button if you would like that feature, live captioning, it's there for you. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's program, New Congress, New Politics. This is a phenomenal program with just the right people. Our guests today are some of the leading thinkers and scholars of Congress. I want to first welcome my good friend, Sarah Binder, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. She's also professor at George Washington University, where she specializes in the study of Congress and legislative politics, as well as being one of the most widely quoted experts in the country on those topics. She's also famous among political scientists for her many publications, including the book Stalemate, Cause and Consequence of Legislative Gridlock. It was published a little while ago, but it never loses relevance. Professor Binder is also a graduate of the Political Science Department at the University of Minnesota and a graduate we are very proud of. I'd also like to welcome my colleague in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Minnesota, Professor Michael Minta, who is an expert on political representation of African-American, Latino, and women interests in the United States. He's written a terrific book called Oversight, Representing Black and Latino Interests in Congress. I recommend it highly. And then our moderator today is Kathryn Pearson, who is associate professor here in the Department of Political Science at the University of Minnesota. Her expertise and research is on the U.S. Congress and congressional elections. Her book, Party Discipline in the House of Representatives, could not be more timely, even though it was published a few years ago. I now turn things over to my colleague and good friend, Kathryn Pearson.
Thank you so much, Larry. It's a pleasure to moderate this panel and dive in as the 118th Congress begins. So thanks to Larry Jacobs and the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance for hosting us today. Before we dive into what has already been an interesting start to the 118th Congress, I want to sort of start by asking Sarah and Michael to talk a little bit about the implications of the 2022 midterms. I know November seems like a long time ago, but it took several days before we knew that the outcome was a narrow majority for House Republicans, taking it back from Democrats. And then it took until a special election to know that the Democrats in the Senate had actually expanded their majority by one to make it for 51 votes. So very narrow margins in both chambers, and also Democrats doing better than expected, given the fact that it was a midterm election with a Democratic president in the White House. And we know that historically that is not good news for the party in power. So Professor Binder, we'll start with you. Just talk a little bit about the elections and sort of what the results mean for what we're going to see in the next 2 years.
Sure. Well, thanks, and thanks very much, especially Minnesota, for inviting me. So your summary of the elections hit it right on the nose, right? That there were expectations going into election season that it would be a great year for Republicans. That in the Senate, there was thinking perhaps they would pick up control of the Senate. All they needed was a net of one seat to change the 50-50 Senate. That turned out not to be true. And we think it didn't work out that way because it was a great evening, as it were, for incumbents of both parties. For the open seats and some of the Republican challengers, it seems that they were a little too out of step. And as political scientists like to say, out of step, out of office. And doesn't always apply to the House, but in the Senate, where you have to run in certainly these sort of big purple states that swing back and forth, you can't be that far out of step. And that really killed off Republican chances of picking up control. Over in the House, as we all know, and you said, there was expectations of a quote unquote red wave. It did not materialize. I think we're still figuring out precisely what led to that outcome, but it does seem that Democrats certainly did better in some of those swingy places, and yet lost seats where they traditionally might have won, especially New York state and some of those California races. It brings us, as you said, split party control, House and Senate, different parties, and different, obviously, party to the in the White House. So what's that mean? Historically, split party control, we think of it as divided government, but like a particularly tough environment for divided government. It's hard to get the House and Senate on the same page. It can be done, but it's even harder than a usual period of divided government. And we'll get to, I'm sure, the particular measures that are going to be causing problems for the House, the Senate, and probably for all of us as well.
Great. Thank you. Professor Minta, anything to add about the 2022 election? Certainly, it brought in the most diverse House of Representatives in history.
Oh, well, that's my cue. First of all, I want to thank Kathryn, thanks for hosting this, and Larry for that great introduction. Wow, I mean, yes, it's one of the most diverse Congresses ever, right? And that's an interesting tidbit, right? So it's one of the most diverse Congress racially and ethnically and gender-wise, but it's probably one of the most polarized, right? And so that trend between polarization and the increase of racial, ethnic, and gender diversity, that's kind of befuddling. And so right now, most racial and ethnic minorities are in the Democratic Party, and they're in the minority party in the House. Now, obviously in the Senate, there's that very slim majority there. More diverse, but not as diverse as the House. But I wanted to go back to talk a little bit about the elections and the midterms and what we think about it. I mean, so that red wave didn't necessarily appear because, like Sarah said, some of it is just candidate selection. Some of it's redistricting effects, not as much, but a lot of it has to do with the former president, Donald Trump. And I mean, look, first of all, the Democrats in that committee on the January 6th committee was a big infomercial for almost 6 or 7 months, right? Of showing how they're against democratic change and just peaceful transition of power, all the ailings of Donald Trump. And then Republicans nominated many people who kind of aligned themselves with Donald Trump. So in a lot of ways, 2022 was almost like a continuation of 2020. And voters, Donald Trump has a coalition, but it's not enough in some of these swing, where it's like 25 to 35 districts in the House that determines the majority. I mean, they could have done a lot better, but just really going far to the right made it very difficult. So instead of Republicans taking control of the House and the Senate, they take control of the House. They lose this. They don't increase their majority at all. I mean, they don't gain anything in the Senate. So I really think that, Republicans, especially moderate and established Republicans, they know that this isn't necessarily the best strategy, But anyway, I know we're going to talk about what happened last week, but yeah, it has a lot of implications on future consequences for the Republican Party.
Great, thank you. And so let's dive into what happened last week. We'll spend a lot of time, I think, now talking about House Republican leadership and specifically the many, many votes for Speaker. Political scientists and the press, really focus when talking about Congress about the polarization between the two parties. And it is very pronounced at record high levels, but significantly, there are obviously some important factional politics within the Republican Party right now. And so, Sarah, if you could start us off by just sort of giving us some historical context. This is something you've written on, and then bring us up to date with the House Speaker votes last week.
Sure. So as you said, we think reasonably so that we're in this period of polarization. And granted, people can disagree about what that polarization, what the term captures, but it certainly captures sort of intense partisanship. Right? The idea that my team's for it, so your team is against it, regardless of whether those are ideological differences, right? Different views about the role of government, say. We definitely have intense partisanship. And yet, as you said, that doesn't belie the fact that there are divisions. There are what we call factions within both the majority and the minority party. So, but these factions in the House on the Republican side have been there. They've been changing shape a little bit over the last decade or so, but today we call them the Freedom Caucus. Although keep in mind there are divisions even within the Freedom Caucus, but we think that the Freedom Caucus stems and comes out of probably that Tea Party wave that emerges in the wake of the financial crisis. And of course, we do have factions historically in both parties. I think what is somewhat unique and worth us thinking about is that this Freedom Caucus, Tea Party, however we describe it, that Freedom Caucus, or whether we call it sort of intense Trump MAGA faction, it's on what we call the far right of the Republican Party and thus of Congress. I think in the past, when we've seen these battles over speakers and over the rules of the game, and we'll come to what those battles were like this time, those factions tend to be in the middle of the Congress, so that they can get some support for the minority party. In a period of polarization or intense partisanship, Democrats aren't very happy today to reach out and to lend any support to the Freedom Caucus and what they're up to. They may come to have common cause about opening up and quote unquote democratizing, right, access to the floor and loosening the grip of party leaders over the agenda. But for now, this is a story about the Republicans and their factions, which is going to sort of play out over the next 2 years in terms of their relationship with the speaker, and then in terms of the ability of House Republicans to pass what we call must-pass measures now that Speaker McCarthy has made a lot of concessions without any really guarantees of cooperation from the Freedom Caucus faction. So I think going forward, I would keep my eyes here on divisions within the Freedom Caucus. You know that Jim Jordan, representative from Ohio, was the leader of the Freedom Caucus for some time, and now he's the chair of the Judiciary Committee, and he was the staunchest floor defender of McCarthy. So there are a lot of divisions there, and we don't have good terminology to capture them. But we want to keep our eyes on the behavior of the Freedom Caucus. And finally, not just because they are ideologically distinct from the rest of the party, because they might not be, but what they are is pretty anti-establishment. They don't like current leaders. They don't like McCarthy. They don't like McConnell. So that doesn't lend themselves to being team players. And I think that's going to be interesting going forward.
Thank you. Were you a quick follow-up, and then I'll turn it over to Michael, sort of midday on Friday, were you thinking that McCarthy would ultimately be speaker, or were you thinking this is not going to happen for him?
Well, my husband Forrest, also a Minnesota PhD, had his book club over early in the week, and they all wanted a performance from Professor Pinto. What's going to happen? And we all know we don't do predictions. I don't do predictions, and I don't do them very well. The last one I made was on November 8th, 2016, when I also had a house full of people who refused to come back again. back again because I was wrong about the presidential election. I said then either he finished, that was Tuesday night, either he finds a way to wrap it up on Wednesday or they're going to be searching for a replacement. I was dead wrong on both. Friday, it was hard. It was still hard to tell at that point until they had that 14th, second to last ballot when McCarthy finally peeled off almost everybody he needed. I guess if we had a really great crystal ball, we might think, wow, McCarthy really gave away the store. He gave away almost everything as best we can tell. Maybe not a subcommittee gavel for one or two of the Freedom Caucus members he held back on. McCarthy promised a lot. And in fact, he promised things he himself can't personally deliver, because there's a committee that gives out committee assignments, even though he promised good committee assignments, we think. So I guess that the fact that McCarthy we'd seen what he's given out, we might have imagined that Freedom Caucus ticked off almost everything on their list, and to keep in mind that it wasn't clear that there was someone else who could get 218 votes, and it's not clear who the Freedom Caucus would have supported. We talked a lot about number 2, Steve Scalise from Louisiana. I think the reporting was the swing district folks weren't really keen on him. I think the tagline that often goes with him is David Duke, sort of Southern segregationist, David Duke without the baggage. I don't really know what the baggage meant, but so I don't think he was actually going to be a solution. And the Freedom Caucus didn't seem wild about anybody in leadership, given their anti-establishment views. So I was wrong on Friday night, but I did enjoy like my Super Bowl. It's really, I didn't know the Super Bowl ran to 2 in the morning, but yeah, it was great. Don't get a lot of excitement. You don't get a lot of uncertainty in the House, but this delivered in droves. So there you go.
All right. Thank you. And Michael, what did you think? What was your prediction?
My gosh. Oh, it was just wonderful. I mean, maybe not good for smooth running of Congress and getting government business done, but as far as reality TV, oh my gosh. I mean, C-SPAN, what were the ratings? I mean, gosh, like their viewership up like 130 something %. I mean, and I was one of those people watching C-SPAN too. It was just wonderful TV to watch. And then even like, was it Friday night where the representative had to be restrained? Was it Mike Rogers had to be restrained from Matt Gaetz? I mean, I couldn't believe it, right? But then we've been studying Congress for so long. We know that stuff like this isn't really unusual, right? There's a history. I mean, there are many years where Congress members would bring guns to the chamber and or even the caning. I mean, so this isn't as unusual as people in modern day, contemporary day, it's unusual, but in the past, I mean, it's been even worse. So what was very interesting though, I like Sarah said, after a while I was starting to think, well, McCarthy maybe needs to just pull out. He's not going to get it. But then we couldn't think but everyone kept saying, who's going to be the alternative? And there really wasn't seemingly a clear alternative. And then also it was like the Freedom Caucus is like, well, what do you guys want? McCarthy's almost given you everything that you wanted. The thing that was interesting to me, I said this maybe a few days ago, it's like, well, it's about taking power away from the speaker and empowering the rank and file members. But then I go back and I remember that Marjorie Taylor Greene was really mad. She's in the Freedom Caucus, and she was like, well, these members are going back and trying to cut deals. And so I'm wondering what members in the Freedom Caucus, what type of deals were cut in terms of committee chairmanships, subcommittee chairmanships, because we know about all this other things like McCarthy had already given on even the motion to vacate. I mean, he'd already given that. He'd already, this committee to investigate government, weaponizing government to use. We already know that that's already, so we're just like, well, what else is going on? And then people were like, and even the Freedom Caucus members, we was like, well, maybe it's something personal against McCarthy. And I'm sure there was something, but many of those members said it's not personal. So I'm just wondering, Jim Jordan, was supporting McCarthy, as Sarah says. Marjorie Taylor Greene. So what was it? I think we'll find out eventually, but I just don't know.
Thank you. Well, certainly these same factional dynamics in the Republican Party weakened former Speaker Boehner to the point that he resigned and made the speakership very difficult for Paul Ryan, who also tried to democratize the House and appease some of the Freedom Caucus, former Tea Party members, but it was challenging. But despite the two speakers in between, Speaker Pelosi's first and second stint as Speaker, she came back in 2019 stronger than ever as Speaker. And she had her own factional politics to deal with. In fact, the margins for Pelosi are exactly the same as the current margins for McCarthy, but she held her party together, voting actually at record high unity. But of course, Pelosi is no longer Speaker. So going forward, both in the minority and whenever Democrats might regain the majority, how do you think this will affect Democrats? Michael, why don't we start with you and then we'll turn to Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, each majority, they get each party, they'll decide their own rules. So just because Republicans are doing it now, I mean, you wonder if many of the squad members like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar, are they taking notes and said, hey, maybe we should have fought a little bit more for what we wanted. And I thought it was very interesting with McCarthy. He told Hakeem Jeffries, who's the minority leader, and Hakeem Jeffries went through and said, I had unanimous support of my caucus. And then McCarthy said, well, Hakeem, I actually had unanimous support of my caucus too when I was in the minority. So he kind of reminded, like, when your time comes, you may actually have to go through this. So, I'm not certain if Jeffries has that type of sway that Nancy Pelosi had. I mean, she was definitely able to go through and hold down kind of the far left of the party. And maybe because at one time, Pelosi was to the left and she was able to cut deals with each member. And she brought up the issues that they wanted. And they got committee assignments that they wanted. So I don't know if it remains to be seen if Jeffries will have the type of sway and pull that Nancy Pelosi has. And it's very possible that we could, maybe not 15 rounds, but it could be more contentious in terms of the squad saying we want more. So.
Great, thank you. Sarah, what do you think of this new Democratic leadership? Jeffries, Clark, Aguilar?
Well, I confess to being a fan of the Democratic acrostic alphabet at 1:30 in the morning when Jeffries got up the gavel and went through the alphabet with the things the Democrats stand for. I thought that was pretty gutsy to do that at 1:30 in the morning when Republicans really want to just coronate Speaker McCarthy. I think sort of Michael put his fingers on it. It's different being in the minority than it is in the majority. There is some advantage to being in the minority because in many ways it's easier to be unified because your job in the modern House is to oppose the majority party. So it may be that McCarthy's prediction is correct, right? When you're in the minority, don't worry, you'll do just fine. So I guess some of the questions here is in part what happens to Democrats if these rules and sort of process changes that we'll talk about, whether they stick and whether they work to the advantage of groups like the Progressive Caucus in the House or the Squad in the House. I think it's always important to keep in mind, and as political scientists, we're, I think, less good about making arguments about the distinctiveness of different qualities of the parties as opposed to treating them as the majority party and the minority party. But there's no denying that there's a difference between sort of the governing instincts of Democrats and at least looking at the Freedom Caucus, their policy objectives, which I think many people would say in the fiscal realm are not politically realistic, that they're the outliers compared to even what other conservatives in the House and Senate are willing to countenance. And I think we'll come to see that if they have when I think many Republicans don't want to vote for the types of cuts that would be required under the promise that McCarthy gave for a balanced budget to the Freedom Caucus. So for Democrats going forward in the next Congress or the next time they wield power, I don't know that the factions on the Democratic side will necessarily be quite at odds with their leaders if they're all in some ways rowing the boat in the same direction, which I don't get that sense from Republicans. I mean, there are some issues, of course, that unify them, cultural issues to a degree, immigration to a degree, deregulation to a degree, but those aren't the issues we've been talking about during the speakership race. And so I'll just be very curious to see where those factions arise on both sides today and in a future Congress, and whether Democrats will be as debilitated, at least in the short run, it looks like on the Republican side. But I think it's a rocky road. It's a little unclear how exactly things play out on both sides of the aisle.
And Sarah, Kathryn, can I add? The one thing that with Jeffries, right, and Aguilar, some of the squad members, at least in the papers, were somewhat concerned that he's too establishment. And maybe that's why he is a speaker, right?
Sure.
Because he's establishment. So they were concerned, but they're in the minority, so I don't think they made a big deal of it. Now, again, like I said, it'll be very interesting whether it's 2 years, 4 years, because it seems that this competitiveness in the House is going to continue. Will he experience some type of pushback from the squad members because he doesn't have the stature of Nancy Pelosi, where Nancy Pelosi is directly responsible for getting many of those members elected to the House. It remains to be seen what happens in these 2 years. What type of political capital can Jeffries, what can he build up in order to keep this type of revolt when the Democrats are in the majority again? So,
yeah. I was going to say, there's like this trade-off that members have to make, right, between empowering leaders to act on their behalf and maybe giving away too much power when it seems you might not be acting on their behalf. Pelosi won that trade-off, right? She was able to dole out little bits of individually, quietly goodies to people who said they're going to oppose her. The trade-off in the Republican side this past week, it was messy, and it's not quite clear how much McCarthy's left with. I think speakership is left with a lot of powers, but it may be hard to wield them given these trade-offs, these concessions that he made.
Well, let's talk about the implications of the factional politics and the trade-offs that McCarthy made on two of the most important issues facing this Congress: the must-pass legislation, increasing the debt ceiling and passing the annual appropriations bills. And those were obviously a subject of concern to Republicans as they elected a speaker, and will be going forward. So I guess starting with the debt ceiling, Sarah, how do you think that will play out?
Predictions? I can't. So I think, well, the interesting part, we know now at the get-go that the two are going to be related, right? The notion of spending cuts that Freedom Caucus and maybe others, probably others, want, but also the question of the debt ceiling, the overall level of debt that can be issued by Treasury. So it seems going in that the likely position of the Republicans will be something similar to what we saw back in 2011 when the country came as close as it's come in a long time to defaulting on its debt, which, as you said, that's why I call it must pass. Government doesn't want to default, and none of us really want to live in a world where U.S. government debt isn't sacrosanct. But we think that the storyline will look something like it looked a decade ago, which is rather than a quote unquote clean increase in the debt ceiling, Republicans, especially in the House, will demand some form of cuts. And in fact, potentially very serious cuts like we saw negotiated out back in 2011. There was a story, I think, Wall Street Journal yesterday that had a couple quotes from some of the what we think of as more the swing voters, swing members in the Republican conference. Is Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, one or two others, and it was a slight comment, but they seemed on board, like recognizing, yeah, of course we should not just do a clean, like we should demand something in terms of paring back certain types of spending. And so if that's what the swing voters, if that's right, and McCarthy needs everybody, minus, he can just lose 4. If that's what the swingy or Republicans are saying at the get-go, it's going to be messy, right? As we know, Senate Democrats don't want to do that, and Biden, the White House doesn't want to do pay something for raising the debt ceiling. But Democrats don't get a say by themselves. Senate Republicans will matter. So it's just messy. And I think we've sort of gotten used to, and financial markets have gotten used to, the fact that Congress walks up pretty closely to that debt ceiling, and quote unquote, we know they won't step over the line. But that faith may be a little misplaced if we're already looking down the aisle there. At the end of the day, whatever the solution is, both parties need to save face, right? And how that happens, I think that's what we want to keep our eyes on.
So I guess one follow-up question is there a scenario in which McCarthy has a dozen of his members and most all of the Democrats to pass the same version of a debt ceiling increase with maybe some spending cuts that the Senate Democrats, that the Senate has passed, or would that endanger McCarthy's speakership? I mean, is that where these two things, is this where the rubber really hits the road?
Yeah, but I think you put your finger on it, right? If we look back a decade ago when Boehner got in problems, and Boehner would say, look, the Freedom Caucus, they wanted to go that way, and only a Boehner would say, a leader without followers is a man taking a walk in the park. So they wanted to go that way, and I followed them, and that got them stuck in what we called the Box Canyon. But eventually they have to come out, right? Because the debt ceiling does eventually have to be raised. But I think that's the key question. Fine, House can do what the Freedom Caucus wants, perhaps tough cuts in exchange for a debt ceiling increase. But if those cuts are too dire, and if the White House has said we won't make any cuts, then what's McCarthy, right? What's McCarthy really? What's he going to do? And just to also keep in the back of our minds here, if you look at all the votes on raising the debt ceiling in divided government, both parties tend to pony up votes, right? Compared to unified party control, where the burden and the expectations are on the majority party, and the minority party is left off the hook, or at least the president's party does the lion's share. But divided government, history says they both participate, so it'll be curious how things pan out.
Thank you. Michael, what else will House Republicans be up to, sort of aside from the must-pass legislation? What do you think their agenda will look like for the next 2 years?
Besides investigating Hunter Biden and the FBI and the January 6th committee, I think it's just going to be an era of divided government, of basically the minority party really trying to investigate the party of the presidency. So, I mean, I imagine that they will look at all of the issues, especially with the January 6th committee. Many Republicans were left off. And so they're concerned that it was a partisan and a biased election. So I think you'll see a lot of time spent on trying to retell that narrative or provide a different side of that narrative. I think you will see any type of scandal that's associated with the president. This is all in preparation for 2024. I mean, to really kind of set the stage to show that there's a difference between the parties. I'm in terms of policy, in terms of cutting things, I mean, I think there'll be a push, as Sarah said, to try to cut things. But if it's really an issue about the deficit, I mean, we know the entitlements, Medicare, Social Security, they're not going to touch that. So now we're talking about more discretion. They're not, Democrats or Republicans, they're not going to touch defense. So now we're going to start talking about even more discretionary programs like, welfare or aid to schools and states. So I think that we're going to see those type of debates in addition to the oversight. So I don't know what they're clear, because they can't pass it. So you just imagine, and I imagine there'll be another attempt to try to repeal Obamacare in the House. So yeah, it's who knows.
Thank you. A lot of messaging bills that will go nowhere. But turning to the Senate, obviously we'll see some confirmations. But Sarah, what are we expecting out of the Senate? We've barely talked about the Senate at all today.
I was pretty amazed that the Senate came in last week. Minority Leader McConnell became the longest serving Senate leader, majority or minority-ish, ever. And nobody paid him any attention because we were all staring at the C-SPAN cameras in the House. And then they slipped out of town. But they'll be back. And I think as we always want to do, we want to keep our eyes on how does the majority leader, Democrat Schumer, how does he manage to pursue the Biden agenda in a world where the House won't cooperate, and in a world where he needs support from at least nine Republicans? I think, as you said, they will refocus their attention and double down on confirmations, both of executive branch employees who still aren't in place, despite the fact that Biden nominated many of them over a year, or if not two, ago, and to focus on the courts, recognizing that if Biden doesn't run, or Democrats don't keep the White House, they've lost the opportunity to try to reshape the courts and to try to counterbalance the changes in a more conservative direction that Trump was able to make with his appointments. So I think that's the focus. But of course, when spending bills and the debt ceiling come up, that will consume our attention, and the Democrats, obviously, in the Senate as well.
This is a question really for either of you. What do you think the implications are for support for the war in Ukraine of new divided government?
I've read different things. I mean, obviously, usually both parties, when you're support, there's usually general support, but I've heard some rumblings that we might need to pull back on some of our funding from Republicans of the Ukraine. So I'm not entirely sure what's going to happen with that, or if that's going to be a top agenda item. Sarah could say next, but I wanted to add one quick thing to what Sarah was saying. One thing that I'm watching in the Senate is Kyrsten Sinema. Her switch from the Democratic Party to being an independent, and what type of implications that may have in terms of the negotiations, whether it's the debt ceiling or spending cuts. I mean, is she going? I mean, we already know that she and Senator Manchin have always been kind of highlighted as these power brokers. But I wonder, how is she willing to form coalitions with, say, Republicans in order to get things done, or even maybe hold up some of these nominations? I mean, it'll be very difficult for her to do that. But I'm just wondering, how much will she be in coalition with the because technically she's not a Democrat anymore, even though she still caucuses with them. So looking for that. Sorry, back to the Ukraine. Sorry.
I think I guess we'll first to keep in mind that the Biden administration, I think it's fair to say they anticipated difficulties in this current calendar year with a Republican majority, and they the last of that omnibus spending bill in December really did pack in, I don't have the number at the top of my head, 30 billion maybe, of more money, both military and domestic-ish side for Ukraine. And I think the intention was to hold over the funding for that initiatives so that the Congress doesn't have to immediately address the issue of funding for Ukraine. My guess is certainly coming out of the House, Republicans will try to put a condition on the money, even if it's watered down to be something like reports, benchmarks, something along the lines perhaps of what we saw back a decade, 15 years ago with the funding for the war in Iraq when Democrats regained control of the Congress and it was Republican Bush, trying to put some sort of greater transparency on how the monies are being spent. Whether that flies on the Senate side, where there really is quite robust bipartisan support, that's not clear. But it does promise to be on the Republican side in the House, sort of one of these issues that seems to play well for Republicans back to their base. The sort of quote unquote American first. Why are we spending money abroad? We have needs here. So I think it may be a little while before we see fireworks over that. And of course, everything is, conditional on the promises that McCarthy made that they were going to somehow magically do each of the dozen spending bills one by one. And I think one of the promises or conditions in the list I saw was that the Senate would adopt them, which I thought was one of McCarthy's bolder promises. So
right, telling the Senate what to do.
Yeah. So, and one of the ways the Ukraine money was passing in the past Congress is that most of the time it was packaged in those bigger spending bills. And so Republicans, if they wanted to, could vote against it. Democrats didn't need their votes. But what happens now when you streamline these? In theory, the House is going to streamline their bills to do one at a time, where votes on Ukraine will be quite visible. No one really thinks that the Republicans can really commit to, these siloed bills one by one because of the difficulty of passing them. And in the Senate, the difficulty of passing any appropriations bills. So it's a little messy, but there's probably more a glide room here for the administration, given how much they bulked up on Ukraine spending from the last Congress.
Sorry about that. Zoom just closed and kicked me off. So I missed whatever was said for the last minute.
We just finished up on Ukraine. We solved all the problems.
Okay. Wow. All right.
Not to make light, but
I'm going to now turn to questions from the audience, which, because my Zoom quit, have now all disappeared. But there was one question that asked about expanding the size of the House of Representatives. What do you think about expanding it so that there are more voices, better representation? Obviously, this would mean that some states would send more representatives. Minnesota might not have to worry about losing one of its 8 seats every 10 years. That's to either of you.
You want me to start it? Yeah, that kind of goes back. I'm just thinking about these old Federalist, anti-Federalist debates about whether you should have more members in Congress. I mean, I don't know if there's been much empirical research, really, just even speculating or doing simulations to say if the results would actually change, and would different perspectives and voices be heard. Would certain jurisdictions or districts get more money or attention? I mean, it's unclear if that. And you're speaking to a representation person who writes about political representation. So I'm always like, yeah, more voices, more perspectives. But in this highly polarized and where partisanship is just, the leadership is concerned about keeping that majority, it's unclear if expanding the number of members in the House is really going to change the way the parties operate the House of Representatives. It's just more people that they would have to deal with, and yeah, so it's unclear if you would have a different result or either more representations. So
Yeah, I'm sort of in the same boat as Michael, which I don't know that I've seen too many concrete studies of implications. But the arguments in favor and opposed, I guess, are clear, right? I guess the argument in favor is that districts with 900,000 people aren't fair to voters because of the lack of contact with members. And the access to members is just limited compared to if you expanded the House and pared back the size, just as a population matter, pared back the size of the districts. And doing that might get better alignment between cities and counties and how they're represented, and then the overlaying House district, the lines of the House district. And maybe that would create some sort of continuities of representation that might be helpful. And of course, it may redound to the benefit of the minority party if there are more chances to run, as it were. Can the House handle so many cooks in the kitchen? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. So I think that is, I think to me, that's the sort of key question, how the House would function. And is it possible that the House would have to centralize even more if there's so many more members, right? Does that type of delegation run amok, making it harder? And if we know from today's watching the House is that there is a movement, there is some pressure to open up access to the floor and so forth. Open rules where any member, I don't know what the size of the new House would be, but that would be a lot. They already can't handle all those open amendments. So I could see why they're treading carefully here. And I mean, there are other ways to deal with this. Change the formula for how they allocate the seats so that maybe there's a little less of a bias against large states. But it seems like something wouldn't just requires a law. But I think there may be too many unknown consequences for lawmakers to go down that path just yet.
Great, thank you. Quickly, a question from the audience that was sort of circulating in the conversation more generally last week. In the battle over the speakership, what would have prevented a handful of moderate Republicans from nominating one of their own, in other words, another moderate Republican, and then inviting the Democrats to vote for him or her?
It's everybody's favorite solution. Someone in my house was pushing it, and I kept saying, it's not going to happen. So the one prediction that ever came true. So I think the problem here goes back to the first thing we talked about. This is no matter how fractious the Republicans are, they're still sort of closer to each other than they are to the Democrats. And crossing that partisan barrier, that's really hard. I don't think Democrats want to lend any votes for a Republican speaker. It just was never going to happen. They don't want to give up. These are teams. They're players. They wear the same jersey. I just can't see the core procedural vote, Democrats giving it to a Republican. And in past speakership battles, go back 100 years, when it was the Republicans with the conflict in the factions and Democrats, they just sat back, and they weren't even as polarized back then. They just sat back. They weren't going to get involved in the other party's leadership contest.
Along those lines, if I could follow up, if just one Republican, wants to vacate the speakership and so calls a vote, can we expect every single Democrat to vote to vacate the speakership? Michael, what do you think?
I can't see Democrats getting involved in that, because I mean, there's a lot at stake, right? So even though it was great TV, reality TV for us, but to call a vote, say in the middle of session, to vacate the speakership, just messes up a lot of business that the chamber has to perform. So I think most Democrats would do that, and I actually don't think most Republicans would be on board with that either. But it would probably be good for like MSNBC and Fox News and all the other networks to have that happen.
Question about both parties' leaders and their relationship to Minnesota. So one questioner wonders why there's not a single Midwestern Democrat in the Democratic Party leadership, sort of suggesting that Democrats aren't being very responsive to a large swath of the country. Another questioner wants to know, now that Tom Emmer is majority whip in the House, will Minnesota see more attention, whether it's earmarks or policies or otherwise?
I'll just tackle the first part and then refer to the Minnesotan experts and Minnesotans. The second part, I don't know that Democrats per se have learned their lesson. I'm thinking of like a Tom Foley from Washington State who loses his election back in the 1990s. It makes sense that, makes sense in one way, for parties to choose leaders from places that are solidly within the fold of that of their party. So Nancy Pelosi from San Francisco and Hakeem Jeffries from Brooklyn. So it certainly provides them some electoral insulation, so they don't, one always has to worry about their reelection. Exhibit A, Eric Cantor, the Republican leader who lost his Virginia seat. He wasn't even in his district on election day back a dozen years ago. But it does soften the demands of attention to your district. That is, you can fly around raising money and campaigning on behalf of your members in a way that you probably couldn't if you were Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan, or even if you were Abigail Spanberger from Virginia, right? These contested, tough races for Democrats to hold on to. It's not really a tenable model for them to be your leader.
Yeah.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to talk about Majority Whip Emmer?
Emmer, wow. I mean, it should, right? Definitely draws more attention to the state, with Representative Emmer being in such a high profile position. Now the question is, does it translate into resources to the state? I mean, that remains to be seen, right? In terms of will Minnesota get more attention in terms of funding and appropriations and attention to agriculture? Yeah, it remains to be seen. I think that it matters, and not to mention that, and I think it's not lost on us too that Minnesota is a purplish state. And even though, we know that most of what happens in the state, most of the population are in these urban areas, and then the battles are being fought on the burbs. And so I would imagine that Representative Emmer will do all that he can to use his position to raise money for various candidates, and to possibly make some of those suburban districts more friendly toward Republicans next time. So when there is a presidential election, if you can get those suburbs to change some, Minnesota could be a red state. I know you're skeptical, you're looking skeptical, but it might happen. I don't know.
There's certainly some narrow divides. Minnesota has
Yes.
a 4-4 congressional district, of course. I think in terms of attention, Minnesota would have certainly benefited had the parties moved it up in the nominating process, as the Minnesota DFL was trying for, but that's sort of a separate issue. Thinking ahead to a few different things, we're going to do sort of a lightning round. What do people expect to happen? We'll go both this Congress and longer term regarding the Senate filibuster, adding more members to the Supreme Court. And then finally, an astute questioner notes that it's been a very long time since the House has successfully passed 12 appropriations bills separately and on time and had them signed into law. And so is this a realistic expectation for this year? So Supreme Court, Senate filibuster, annual appropriations process. We only have a couple more minutes left. So Sarah, start with any one of those and then we'll pass it to Michael.
Okay, I'll take filibuster for 200. It's off the table. We're abolishing the legislative filibuster in this Congress because where would those bills go? They won't pass the House. And so that takes it off the table. I tend to think that the Senate, if you look at the ways in which and timing when they changes its rules and practices, I think they're on a long, slow, it's the Senate, slow Senate march to majority rule, right? They have been paring back the excesses of the filibuster, nominations, variations on different little parts of the cloture rule, the budget law. So it may take a while to get there. And I don't know the issue that provokes it, but I would think one party or the other finally musters 51 to curtail the legislative filibuster. Until that's done, I don't think either party in the current formulation could ever expand the court because the other party will oppose. And then briefly on the spending bills, I think the last time they did the 12 bills individually through each chamber and signed into law separately was 1995 or 1997. There was a balanced budget that year. There was more money to go around. It seemed to have smoothed the edges. I don't think it's realistic, and not just because it hasn't been done in a while, but it hasn't been done in a while because it's hard to get people to vote for very isolated, smaller bills. You have to package them up so that everybody gets a little bit of what they want, and you give in a little bit to the other person, and then you let the people who aren't going to vote for anything vote against it. That's modern day legislating, right? That's how leaders cope with all sorts of uncertainty and polarization and divisions. They package it all together. So I assume in some form eventually we'll see that this year.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, I mean, what Sarah's saying, I mean, we've seen the rise in omnibus bills over time, and I don't think that's going to decrease anytime soon, particularly as in a polarized Congress. In terms of the filibuster, I mean, I don't necessarily see it for major legislation. That's really about the only thing that's left. I don't see that changing anytime soon. There's always this push to do it, but under divided government, it's not going to happen. And as Sarah said, with the court packing, I mean, even Biden has again said that he's not supportive of that. So I don't see that necessarily going anywhere. The one thing that I do see going possibly somewhere is like border enforcement. I mean, apparently Biden has been to the border recently. Kamala Harris has been there. I think there might be some more movement on that. I mean, I know in the last Congress there was some movement, but I think there might be a potential if you're going to see this divided Congress produce anything. I think it might be related to border enforcement and border control. So.
And finally, how do you think the 2024 presidential nominating contest will affect the House and affect the Senate and congressional responsiveness more generally?
I'm happy to have Michael take that one.
Yeah, I really don't. Are you talking about in terms of like the this competition on where it should be?
No, sorry. That just, we're gearing up for another presidential election. How is that going to affect Congress?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think it's going to, and I was saying this, the margins, I mean, Democrats had 222 in the House when they were, so it's a slim majority too. I really think that that the higher turnout will, in a presidential election, will benefit Democrats actually more. I think there's a real chance they could take the House back, but the concern that they could lose the Senate. So because there's so many more seats in play. So I mean, I don't know what this higher turnout, it depends on what Biden does. It depends on how much hell the Freedom Caucus members raised during the time. But I think that higher turnout definitely bodes well for for Democrats.
The only thing I would add is that sometimes presidential elections like give the opposition party the incentive to show that they can govern and they cooperate, oftentimes in the odd year rather than the actual presidential year. And then we've seen that periodically, but we also have presidential election years where the parties say, why compromise? Why take half a loaf? Why don't we hold out and try to get unified party control and get a whole loaf for us? And I don't think we know exactly or able to predict exactly which version we're going to get. But you can imagine some Republicans, especially on the Senate side, wanting to show voters that they can govern. And those are terms that McConnell often uses when he greenlights going to the bargaining table. But we'll see. Depends, as Michael said, on who's running for sure.
Thank you.
Oops.
You're on mute.
Now we can, I think.
Now you hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you, the three of you. It's one of the most interesting, probing discussions of Congress. Lots of new material covered here. I want to thank everyone who joined us today as well. Before you go, I just want to quickly share some information about our next event, which is called Obstacles at Every Turn. And it focuses on overcoming barriers to Native American voting. This is part of our Certificate in Election Administration program. And this will be Wednesday, February 8th at 11 a.m. We have several other programs we're working on that may come up before then. Also, I want to let you know that a video recording and a podcast of this session will be coming up in the next day or two. You can find it by searching on Dialogue Across Difference and here are all your favorite places to look. If you want to make sure you don't miss anything, you can subscribe to our podcast and be sure that. Finally, I want to just let you know that all our programming is free and open to the public. And we do, as you might expect, welcome contributions to make that possible. You can reach out to us at cspg@umn.edu. Finally, big thanks to Sarah Binder and Michael Minta and our moderator, Kathryn Pearson. All of you have a great day. Take care.